Allah subhanahu has said in the Quran, about the Quran, Hudan wa dhikra li ulil albab, that it is a guidance and a reminder for the people of sound intellect. And Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah said, وَلِهَذَا تَجِدُ خِطَابُ الْقُرْآنِ إِنَّمَا هُوَ مَعَ أُولِي الْعُقُولِ وَالْأَلْبَابِ, where he said, and you will recognize that the message of the Quran is only for those people who have sound intellect. And so, if the message of the Quran can only properly be understood through sound intellect and sound reasoning, then it becomes our responsibility to protect this gift, this tool, this intellect that Allah subhanahu has given us. And so to safeguard and to help us safeguard this intellect, Allah subhanahu has prohibited alcohol, prohibited drugs. And to help this intellect, this intelligence grow and increase, Allah has mandated many things. And amongst those things, we find, if we look in Islam, that Allah subhanahu has mandated gatherings. The pandemic has come and gone. And after the pandemic, certain gatherings stopped to exist. Corporations and companies ceased to exist. Certain houses of worship closed their houses of worship and took their services online. But here we are, gathered because Islam requires certain types of gatherings. These gatherings are required because it fosters intelligence. These gatherings bring people together so that there's an exchange of ideas. How many of us would never have known each other if it wasn't for Islam and its gatherings? How many of us would not have learned or benefited from one another if it wasn't for Islam and its gatherings? So these gatherings serve as a tool to increase our IQ, to increase our intelligence. Why the intelligence? Why is this important? We use and we need our senses, the smell, the sight, the taste, the touch, and the hearing to enjoy God's blessings in this world. Tasting that delicious food, smelling those amazing flowers. It's through these five senses. But we need our intelligence to understand how we can benefit from these blessings in this world, to transform them into a positive in the hereafter and the afterlife. And so Allah has legislated daily gatherings, which are the 5 salawat, the 5 prayers. The weekly gathering, which is the Jum'ah, the Friday. The annual gathering, which is the Eid, which we're commemorating right now. And this is to ensure with these gatherings that we don't get trapped in a bubble where we live in our own heads. And these gatherings enable us to speak, to talk, to converse, and to exchange ideas, and to maintain our sound intellect. And then Allah subhanahu included a gathering on a global scale, where it's happening right now. 2.5 million people have gathered for Hajj on this massive global scale. Allah subhanahu said, Al-Hajju ashhurun ma'lumat, فَمَنْ فَرَضَ فِيهِنَّ الْحَجَّ فَلَا رَفَثَ وَلَا فَسُوقَ وَلَا جِدَالَ فِي الْحَجِّ وَمَا تَفْعَلُ مِنْ خَيْرٍ يَعْلَمْهُ اللَّهُ وَتَزَوَّدُوا فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى وَاتَّقُونِي يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Where Allah subhanahu talks about the Hajj being an obligation, then talks about how to perform Hajj, but then He ends it by speaking to Ya Ulil Albab, speaking to the people of sound intellect. Because this Hajj, this gathering, where people come from all over the world, are now able to exchange ideas and discuss and change their thoughts to become better. Allah addresses the people of sound intellect because the people of sound intellect will benefit from this gathering. So He says, وَاتَّقُونِي يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Have taqwa of me. Taqwa meaning hoping for Allah's mercy so you obey Him. You fear His punishment so you don't disobey Him. Allah is speaking to those people who have intellect to have taqwa, meaning our sound intelligence, sound intellect will get us closer to Allah subhanahu, will enable us to have taqwa. So Islam does not want us to be blind to our blindness, where our intellect may be clothed with biases and we may not realize that. At times in societies, certain ideas are injected, certain philosophies are promoted, and sometimes when we hear them over and over again, or when we see them over and over again, we start to accept them. We start to think that they're good. At the University of Michigan, researchers put an ad on the front page of the university's newsletter. That ad on the front page was a box, and they would put random Turkish words there, kardiga, and different words that students, what are these words, what they mean? No idea what the definition is, what language it is. So they went to the office and asked, what is this weird ad that's appearing on the front page of our newsletter? And the words, there's certain words that are appearing we don't understand. The response that they gave them was, this is an anonymous advertiser who wants to advertise, take an advertisement in that box. Several weeks later, these researchers then sent a questionnaire to these students and asked the students, rate the words on this list that you think are good. And those Turkish words appeared in that questionnaire. And overwhelmingly, the students rated the Turkish words as something good, even though they had no idea what it meant. What was happening here? There was frequency exposure bias, or the mere exposure effect. That when we're exposed to something over and over again in a good way, we are biased to accept it as something good. For how can a university allow a bad word to be advertised on the front page of a newsletter? And so without even knowing the definition of these words, they regarded it as something good. And if we look throughout history, there are certain philosophies that are pushed on societies. For example, you may have heard of this statement, that it's up to you to find your purpose in life. Something very popular. What's your purpose in life? It's up to you to find and define your purpose in life. This actually comes from the philosophy of existentialism, where they say it's up to the human being to define his purpose, and the Creator has no role, no right to define the purpose of human beings. So the statement may sound innocent, that hey, it's up to you to find your own purpose, but there's more meaning behind it, and we hear it over and over again. And this is just an example of how we may accept things and regard them as unharmful or as good statements, but in reality, we are victims of the frequency exposure bias. So Allah subhanahu, this is why Allah subhanahu says, ulil albab. He didn't say ulil uqul. It doesn't appear in the Quran, ulil uqul, the people of intellect. He says ulul albab. Albab is a certain type of intellect. Albab comes from the word lub. Lub means the core, meaning when the intellect is at its core, pure form. This is what Allah subhanahu is talking about, so that we can strip our intellect of foreign influences and biases that may have crept in. And this is the gathering of Hajj that we are experiencing or going through today, which is happening in Mecca. We get this message from that. As we know, those who are in ihram are not allowed to cut their nails, cut their hair. What happens is that we are brought back to our raw human form. And this happens in a similar situation here for those who are performing udhiyah. If you're slaughtering an animal for udhiyah, we're not allowed for these 10 days, if we intended to slaughter an animal, the person who is slaughtering is not allowed to cut our nails or our hair and let it grow until we slaughter the animal. And then we're able to return and cut our nails and our hair. The message here is that during these 10 days, we see our raw, pure human form come out of our hair growth and nail growth. And so when we slaughter, one of the messages we get is that we are to slaughter our biases to make sure that our intellect remains pure. My dear brothers and sisters, this beautiful gift of our intellect, it is our responsibility to make sure our intellect is free from biases so that we don't make the wrong decisions. It is our responsibility to develop this intelligence so that we can understand the Quran more. Allah is speaking to the people who have this intelligence, who have sound intellect. So if we want Allah to speak to us, it's our responsibility to make sure that we don't engage in logical fallacies and we do things which contradict our sound intellect. So these gatherings that Allah has made is a tool that fosters the development of this intellect and intelligence. But there's also a wrong way to use the gatherings that Allah subhanahu has instituted in Islam. And this was done by shaitan, because shaitan was in a gathering. He was in a beautiful gathering. He was amongst the angels. And when Allah subhanahu commanded him to make sujood, instead what he did, instead of using that gathering as a form of enlightenment or a form of learning or a form of increasing intelligence, he used that gathering in the wrong way by saying, Ana khayru min, that I am better than Adam. So one of the diseases and the problems and the misuse of gatherings is when we see people from a different ethnicity, or we see people from a different race, and we think for some reason we're better than them. Or we see people from a different economic status, and for some reason we think we're better than them. Or if we're wearing certain brand name clothes, we think we're better than these people. So this is the wrong way of how a gathering is to be used. But the right way of it to be used is to eradicate this racism or this I am better than you concept. And thus Allah subhanahu talked about, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. Well, Allah subhanahu said, O mankind, we have created you into societies, these massive gatherings, and into tribes, into these gatherings. What is the purpose of that? That we've been created into these societies and tribes so that we may get to know one another, so there may be discovery, so that I may think about myself. Perhaps the opposite of what I think may be true, and that what I think may not necessarily be correct, and that my thinking should not be like a train, but because of this diversity and because of me meeting people from other backgrounds and other thoughts, let me check, is my reasoning sound? Am I engaged in logical fallacies? Let me be enlightened by this gathering that Allah subhanahu has instituted in the deen of Allah Jalla wa Ala. I ask Allah subhanahu to bless all of our gatherings, to protect our intellect, and to increase our intelligence. ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Eid Mubarak to everyone. تقبل الله منا ومنكم جميعا.